The bus was packed. A typical morning rush hour. People squeezed together holding onto the metal poles, their faces buried in phones or lost in thought. The hum of the engine filled the air, punctuated by the occasional cough or the shuffle of feet. It was one of those days when the city seemed to move in fast forward, everyone just trying to get to their destination. Among the crowd, an elderly black man sat in a corner seat, his weathered face calm, eyes distant, as if he was somewhere far away reflecting on a past few could imagine. His hands rested on his lap, his posture straight, but there was something about the way he sat, composed, unhurried, that suggested a life lived with strength. And then there was him, the young man who had just boarded the bus. His clothes were loud, his energy louder. He was the kind of person who made an impression without even trying. He pushed through the crowded aisles, brushing past people without so much as an apology, until he saw the empty seat beside the elderly man. With a smirk, he stood there glaring down, waiting as if it were his right to take that seat. The bus jolted forward, but this man wasn't interested in the ride, not yet. He had his eyes fixed on the older man. The tension in the air was undeniable as the younger man spoke up, his tone sharp, demanding. The elderly man, however, didn't react immediately. He sat still, perhaps waiting, perhaps letting the young man stew in his own brashness. The scene was set. The young man's voice broke through the quiet hum of the bus, cutting through the air with a sense of entitlement. "Hey, old man, move. I need that seat." He snapped his words, sharp, dripping with disrespect. He stood over the elderly man, his arms crossed, clearly expecting compliance. His tone wasn't just demanding, it was dismissive, as if the older man's presence barely mattered in the sea of people. The bus rumbled beneath them, but the young man didn't flinch. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowed. "Come on, don't make me ask again," he added louder now, as if to make sure everyone around could hear. His impatience was clear. The other passengers, caught in the uncomfortable tension, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none dared to intervene. The elderly man sitting quietly said nothing. He simply looked out the window, as if he hadn't heard a word. His silence seemed to only fuel the young man's irritation. The bully, unaware of who he was dealing with, continued to pressure the man. There was no empathy in his eyes, no consideration for the years, the struggles, or the wisdom that sat before him. All he saw was a frail old man, in his way a person he felt entitled to push around. What the young man didn't know, what no one around him knew, was that this man had lived through history. That seat, he demanded, wasn't just a spot on a bus. It was something earned through a lifetime of experiences, sacrifices, and untold stories. But for now, all the bully saw was a man who he thought had no right to take up space. The elderly man remained unmoved, his face steady, as though the young man's outbursts were no more than a distant noise. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, or even acknowledge the aggression that was being hurled at him. His hands stayed rested on his lap, his eyes still focused on the view outside the window, as if he were lost in a place far beyond the chaos of the bus. The young man's demands grew louder, sharper, but the older man's calmness only deepened the contrast. The bully leaned in closer, his anger rising with every passing second, but the elderly man simply shifted slightly in his seat, his body language soft, unbothered. It was almost as if he was waiting for the storm to pass unaffected by the storm brewing in front of him. Finally, the elderly man spoke, his voice low, almost gentle. "I've been through a lot more than you think, son," he said, his words measured but firm. The bully paused for a moment, caught off guard by the softness, the calmness of the elderly man's tone. There was no anger, no yelling, no fighting back, just a quiet resolve that seemed to shake the young man's confidence for the first time. For a split second, the entire bus seemed to hold its breath. The bully, who had expected to intimidate, found himself standing before someone who wasn't rattled by his attempts. The onlookers, who had been waiting for the inevitable confrontation, were just as surprised. They had expected fireworks, tension in the air, But instead, there was only silence, and in that silence, something deeper seemed to be unfolding. The bully, momentarily stunned, had no idea what was about to happen next. The elderly man shifted slightly in his seat, as if to adjust to the moment. The bus hummed along, but there was a different energy now. The young man stood there still unaware, his arrogance slowly starting to fade as the words hung in the air. With a slow, deliberate movement, the elderly man turned to face him. His eyes, once distant, now locked onto the young man's with a quiet intensity. "I served," he said, his voice steady, but carrying weight. "In Vietnam, 1968. I was on the front lines." The words were simple, yet they hit like a punch no one saw coming. The young man froze, his brashness faltering as the meaning of those words began to sink in. Around them, the bus seemed to quiet down, as if everyone could feel the shift. The elderly man didn't boast or demand recognition. He didn't need to. His eyes spoke volumes, eyes that had seen more than most would ever imagine, eyes that had lived through years of hardship, sacrifice, and service. His back remained straight, not from pride or arrogance, but from a deep, quiet respect for the life he had lived. The significance of his service wasn't just in the medals or the years of war he endured, it was in the quiet strength he carried with him every day. He had seen things that most people would never understand, and yet here he was, still standing, still composed, still holding his ground in a world that often took his sacrifices for granted. It was a respect that didn't need to be demanded. It was earned in the unspoken stories of survival and resilience, stories the young man could never have known nor understood in that moment. The words hit the young man like a slap across the face. Vietnam, 1968. The realization began to dawn on him, but it didn't come all at once. He stood there blinking, trying to process what he had just heard. The cocky expression faded from his face, replaced by confusion, then embarrassment. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, he seemed to grasp that he had just crossed a line he hadn't even seen before. His body language shifted, his shoulders tensed, his eyes darted away from the elderly man's steady gaze, and he took a half step back. The arrogance that had fueled him moments before seemed to drain away, leaving only the faintest hint of shame. His bravado evaporated, replaced by something else, a flicker of regret, maybe even guilt. The young man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure now of what to do or say. The rest of the bus felt the change too. The passengers, who had been tense waiting for the next move, watched as the bully faltered. He glanced around, perhaps hoping to find anyone who would back him up. But all he met were eyes that were no longer on his side. For a brief moment, the bus was silent except for the faint hum of the engine. The young man's face flushed, his hands nervously adjusting the strap of his bag. He had expected to intimidate, to get his way. But now he was the one caught off guard, unsure of how to respond to a man whose history far surpassed his own petty demands. His gaze returned to the elderly man, who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, still waiting with a calm that seemed to put everything into perspective. The young man swallowed hard, his arrogance completely gone. The bus had fallen into an uneasy quiet, the usual hum of conversation replaced by the weight of what had just unfolded. The passengers, who had been eyeing the confrontation, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down, avoiding eye contact, perhaps unsure of how to react. Others seemed to glance at the young man, their expressions a mix of surprise and disappointment. They had witnessed something far beyond a simple disagreement. What they had seen was a young man's ignorance clashing with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned the right to be respected. One woman sitting near the back of the bus shook her head slowly, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Her eyes remained on the elderly man, a look of silent admiration crossing her face. She hadn't said a word, but the way she looked at him now said everything. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that there was so much more to a person than what met the eye. A man sitting in the aisle seat near the bully shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. He had been one of the onlookers who had waited for the confrontation to escalate, maybe even expected it. But now, seeing the elderly man speak of his service, his hands clasped in his lap, the man's face softened. He didn't speak up, but there was a moment where their eyes met, one filled with recognition, as if the lesson was clear. Respect is not given based on age or appearance. It's earned through actions, through the life one lives. The young man, now shrinking back into himself, seemed to feel the weight of every gaze. It wasn't the kind of attention he was used to. No one was on his side anymore. Everyone on the bus in that moment was a silent witness to the power of respect and the folly of making assumptions. There was a shared understanding now among the passengers that they had just witnessed something profound, an exchange that went beyond just a seat on a bus. It was a reminder that sometimes the person you least expect may have a history, a story that commands far more respect than you could ever imagine. In the end, the lesson is clear. Appearances can be deceiving, and true respect is earned through actions, not assumptions. The elderly man's calm response to the bully's disrespect revealed that there's far more beneath the surface of every person we encounter. The young man, initially full of arrogance, learned the hard way that judging someone by their outward appearance could lead to a regretful realization. Respect is something that must be earned and given freely, regardless of age, race, or any other surface level factor. So next time you encounter someone who seems unassuming, take a moment to think, what stories, what experiences, what strength might they be carrying with them? Are we quick to judge, or do we choose to see the person beyond the surface? If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. Let's continue to learn and grow together. Please note, this is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. While it conveys a powerful message about respect and assumptions, the events and characters are not based on real individuals or actual events. The story is intended to inspire reflection and promote positive values.